Power has a way of convincing people that consequences belong to everyone else. When victory keeps coming, pride starts to feel permanent. And when fear fades, mercy often disappears with it. History is filled with names that once made nations tremble until one quiet moment revealed how fragile their strength really was. Long before the fall, there is always a season when arrogance feels untouchable, when cruelty feels justified, and when the powerful forget that God is still watching. That is where this story begins, not with a name, but with a warning about what happens when triumph blinds the heart. Zalmuna ruled with confidence born from violence. As a Midianite king, he and Zeba led armies that crushed villages, stole harvests, and left grief behind them like dust in the wind. Israel lived under fear, watching their land stripped and their future threatened. Yet while oppression spread, God was already at work, raising Gideon, an unlikely deliverer who doubted his own strength and hid from enemies that Zalmuna believed would never fall. What Zalmuna could not see was that God does not measure power by numbers or weapons, but by obedience and humility. When Gideon's army was reduced to only 300 men, it seemed absurd against the vast Midianite force. Zalmuna slept confident, surrounded by thousands, certain that no force could reach him. But God moved through the night with precision, confusion, and holy authority. Without swords clashing in the beginning, panic tore through the Midianite camp. Warriors fled, alliances fractured, and kings who once commanded terror ran for their lives. Zalmuna was no longer a ruler issuing orders, but a fugitive trying to outrun judgment. Captured at last, Zalmuna stood face to face with Gideon. The man he once dismissed now held authority over his fate. Gideon confronted him about the men Zalmuna had killed at Tabor Brothers, whose lives had been taken without mercy. Zalmuna's response revealed everything his victories had built inside him. He spoke with pride, admitting his guilt without remorse, as if strength alone justified his actions. But God's justice does not forget spilled blood, and no throne is high enough to escape accountability. In the end, Zalmuna fell not because Gideon was powerful, but because God is just. His downfall was not dramatic in spectacle, but heavy with meaning. A king who lived by the sword met the consequence of his own violence. The presence of God was not distant in that moment. It was firm, righteous, and unavoidable. What Zalmuna thought was dominance had only delayed the reckoning that God had already written. This story reminds us that unchecked power corrodes the soul. Zalmuna's strength gave him confidence, but it also stripped him of compassion. When success removes our fear of God, it replaces reverence with arrogance, and arrogance always leads to collapse. God may allow seasons where the wicked seem unstoppable, but that silence is not approval, it is patience. Another lesson emerges in the way God uses unlikely people to confront overwhelming evil. Gideon was not trained for royalty or war. He was shaped by obedience. While Zalmuna trusted numbers and intimidation, Gideon leaned into the presence of God. Victory did not come from confidence in self, but dependence on divine direction. When God stands behind obedience, even the smallest force becomes unstoppable. The story also warns against mistaking delay for escape. Zalmuna ruled for a time, believing himself secure. But justice was not canceled, only postponed. God sees what is done in secret, remembers what the powerful forget, and responds at the appointed time. No injustice is lost in history, and no tear shed under oppression is ignored. There is also comfort here for those who feel overrun by forces larger than themselves. Israel's suffering did not mean abandonment. God was working quietly, strategically, and faithfully. The presence of God does not always announce itself with thunder. Sometimes it moves in reduction, stripping away what looks strong so his power can be seen clearly. Zalmuna's end reminds us that authority without humility invites destruction. Leadership that lacks reverence becomes tyranny, and success that forgets God becomes a trap. But obedience, even when trembling, places a person under divine protection. Gideon's victory was not about revenge, it was about restoring justice and reminding nations that God alone reigns. In the end, Zalmuna's story is not merely about a fallen king, but about the certainty of God's justice and the safety found in His presence. Empires rise and fall, reputations fade, and power changes hands, but God remains steady, observant, and faithful. Those who trust in violence will eventually be overtaken by it, while those who walk humbly with God will stand when others collapse. This is not just ancient history. It is a living reminder that no victory lasts without righteousness, and no life is secure apart from God.